Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Fadel Adib, and I'm an associate professor here at MIT. Today, I'm very excited to share with you our research on ambient sensing and monitoring of the underwater world. I want to start this talk by asking a question. What plays the largest role in the world's climate? Is it carbon dioxide, or food production, or transportation? Actually, what plays the largest role in the world's climate is the ocean. It mediates the entire climate system. It determines our weather. And it is also the part of our world that has been most impacted by climate change. For example, over the past few decades, the ocean has absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat content that we have emitted into the atmosphere. Today, the ocean also holds more than 93% of carbon dioxide that is on the planet. With the ocean playing such a major role in climate and being impacted by climate change, you might ask, how much of the ocean have we measured? Let me ask this question in a different way. What percent of the ocean has never been observed? What do you think? It's over 95%. And this is a big problem. For example, it means that we do not know to what extent climate change has impacted over 95% of the ocean. Now, I'm a scientist and an engineer, and in order for me to understand something, I need to measure it. So a few years ago, my group and I embarked on a mission to bring the Internet of Things to observe the underwater world. And our idea was that we're going to take a bunch of sensors, deploy them in the ocean, and use them to understand and decode the hidden parts of the ocean. But as we tried to do that, deploy sensors in the ocean, have them measure conditions and send them back to us, we faced a problem. And the problem was that the battery life of underwater sensors is extremely limited. When we looked deeper into this problem, we realized that the main reason is that even low-power underwater transmitters consume few watts of power and cannot be recharged easily. And what that means is that if these sensors have a battery and they want to transmit their data, they're going to quickly run out of energy. And unlike your smartphone, for example, that you can plug in every day, or smartwatch that you can recharge at the end of the day, it's very difficult to recharge the battery of an ocean sensor once it's been deployed in the ocean. And in fact, because of that, most state-of-the-art sensors for continuously tracking marine animals can only last for a few hours or days. And this makes it very difficult to use them for long-term ocean observations, for example, for climate monitoring or identifying marine migration patterns and so on. And this got us thinking about ways that we could reduce the energy consumption of underwater communication so that we can enable ambient sensing and monitoring of the underwater world. And to do that, my group and I invented a technology that enables underwater backscatter networking. This type of communication technology consumes extremely low power to the extent that you can make our sensors entirely batteries. Let me explain to you how our technology works by comparing it how traditional underwater communication systems work. In these environments, you usually have a large number of sensors that want to communicate, for example, with a drone. For simplicity, let's just focus on one temperature sensor and say that it wants to transmit its data to an underwater drone. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, you cannot use things like Wi-Fi or Bluetooth underwater because their signal dies exponentially in water. Instead, what you usually use in underwater environments is sound, for example, like sonar for communication. So if you have a temperature sensor, it encodes its data using acoustic signals, and it has a speaker, transmits its data using sound to an underwater microphone or a hydrophone. The drone receives and decodes this data. But as I just mentioned, generating sound in underwater environments is power hungry, and so you end up draining the sensor's battery. So in our technology, rather than the speaker or the projector being at the sensor, both the speaker and the microphone are at the drone. And instead, our sensor simply has an acoustic reflector, which you can think of as a mirror. Now, when the speaker on the drone transmits a sound, the sound is going to reflect off this reflector and comes back to the hydrophone receiver. And now, if the receiver wants to communicate data, if the sensor wants to communicate data, all it needs to do is that it needs to change its reflector between two reflective states. For example, mirroring and sending the acoustic signal back or not. And once you can switch between two states, you can communicate in binary. And since we can encode any data in binary, this means that we're able to communicate simply by reflecting acoustic signals, and we're able to communicate any data. So in comparison to traditional underwater communication, where a sensor needs to generate its own acoustic signal, and that consumes a lot of power, in our technology, we communicate simply by reflecting acoustic signals. And such reflection can be done at much lower power. Now, you might be wondering, but what did I do? Didn't I just move all of my energy consumption from the sensor to the drone? And the answer is yes, but that's exactly what we wanted to do, because the drone has its own power source and it can go and recharge itself. And now I can scale this technology to a large number of sensors. Now, all of this is great, but there's still one question, which is how can we control the reflections of acoustic signals? Our idea was to use piezoelectricity to design programmable acoustic reflectors. For those of you who are not familiar, the piezoelectric effect refers to the ability of certain materials to transform mechanical energy to electrical energy. Let me explain this through a simple example. Let us say that you have a piezoelectric material and you're trying to measure the voltage across its terminals. Now, if you have an acoustic signal, for example, coming from a source, this signal travels as a pressure wave. So when it hits the piezoelectric material, the material starts vibrating. And because it vibrates, you start getting a voltage or an electrical signal across its terminal. So you transform an acoustic signal, which is a mechanical signal, into electrical energy, which is voltage. But remember, what I wanted to do is to be able to reflect this signal. And to do that, all we did is that we added a switch across the terminals of the material. When the switch is open, the material behaves freely, the same as before, transforming acoustic signal into electrical signal. Now, let us see what happens when the switch is closed. When the switch is closed, it means that the two terminals or the material are connected to each other. And when they're connected to each other, you cannot have any voltage across it. So you have an incoming acoustic signal, and the terminals are connected so the material cannot vibrate. So what happens to this energy that is coming in when it cannot be translated into electrical energy? It has to be reflected back. And so by simply closing a switch, we're able to transform the material from an absorber to a reflector. And we call this technology piezoacoustic backscatter because it refers to the ability of using piezoelectric materials to backscatter or reflect back acoustic energy. Now, of course, what I described here is our technology at a high level. In our papers, we describe in details how what you actually do is modulate the sonar cross-section of the piezoelectric material, and that is usually modeled using this impedance coefficient through this equation that you can see here in the bottom right. And what we've shown is that our sensor needs 1 million times lower power than state-of-the-art underwater modems. And this technology, this acoustic communication technologies that have been used for the past 50 to 70 years. Not only that, because we're using piezoelectric materials, we've made it in a way that it can harvest energy in the non-reflective or absorptive states. And that allows us to make our entire sensor battery-free and running based on the harvested acoustic energy. So let me show you one of the videos from that we shot in a large experimental pool here on MIT's campus. At the far end of the pool, you could see our projector, which transmits sound, and our hydrophone receiver. And here you can see our batteryless sensor connected to a circuit. And the circuit has an LED. Remember that the circuit has no batteries, but as I play the video, you will see the LED lights up, because it is able to harvest energy and use them to power up the electronics. I also want to show you how we're able to receive the signal using the hydrophone at the far end of the pool. So over here, what I'm going to plot is the amplitude, normalized amplitude of the received signal as a function of time. And this is the signal that we get. So at around 2.5 seconds, the speaker starts transmitting. So you see a peak. And then around 3 seconds, the node starts backscattering, which is why you see the changes between the reflective and the non-reflective state in the signal that is received by the hydrophone. And over the past few years, we've built on this basic idea to develop algorithms and techniques to scale to many nodes and deal with other reflectors in the environment. Here you can see one of the nodes that we built. One of the questions that I often get is that, how do you know in which direction you need to reflect the signal back? And the answer to that is that while I described it as a mirror, it's actually an omnidirectional reflector. So it can backscatter or reflect the signal in all directions. We fabricated and 3D printed them. We also built the hardware for energy harvesting, bidirectional communication, sensor integration, and so on. And this whole thing costs about $100, which is extremely low cost by oceanographic standards, because if you're familiar, underwater and ocean equipment usually costs something of the orders of tens of thousands of dollars. And on top of that, our sensor consumes extremely low power. Over the past few years, we've built on this basic technology, this fundamental technology in many different ways, through new fabrication mechanisms, extending the communication technology, in showing that we could do battery-free underwater GPS, similar to how Wi-Fi and Bluetooth don't work underwater, GPS also don't work underwater. So we've used this technology to enable underwater localization. Also, we've even shown underwater AI for bioacoustics application, and we also show underwater imaging. Now, I don't have time to go over all of these, but I want to quickly tell you about a couple of them. So building on, motivated by our success in enabling underwater sensing, we started thinking whether we can enable underwater imaging, wireless imaging. And last year, we introduced the world's first battery-free underwater camera. I'm going to show you a video of this camera. To the right, you can see our underwater measurement setup, which has our camera and trying to image a coral. And to the left, you can see our received and reconstructed image. As I play this video, you'll notice three things. First, it emits a flash, because in deep sea environments, you don't have light, so we need to do that. Second, there's multicolor illumination, because the lowest power imaging sensor is monochromatic. And so we developed a way to reconstruct color. And the third thing, it's being reconstructed in chunks because of the memory and compute limitations on underwater, on this very low power camera. Here are a few other photos that we got of, for example, an African starfish. Here you could see an image of pollution in the wild. So my students took our camera to one of the lakes in New Hampshire, and they imaged a plastic bottle. And this is here a pretty important and remarkable result. What we did is we took the seeds of a plant and we planted it in an underwater environment, and we saw it sprouting and growing over the days. And the reason this result is so important goes back to how I started by motivating where all of this started, where today you're worried about the battery running out. But because we're able to build an underwater camera that does not require batteries, you're not worried about it running out, and you can capture images continuously and over a long period of time. Beyond the underwater camera, we've been recently also interested in whether we can bring battery-free underwater AI. We've been motivated by recent advances in the tiny ML community. And by bridging these advances to our underwater sensing, low power underwater sensing and computing technology, we showed that we're able to achieve almost 90% accuracy in underwater AI in identifying different marine species, all without requiring any batteries. And all of this is still the beginning of a very exciting journey of what we can do in underwater sensing. So now we're starting to work on, can you take this to another level and go not just to microwatts, but even nanowatts of power levels in sensing? We're collaborating with researchers to scale our technology to oceans to kilometer scale communication. We're building on this in robotic exploration. And there's many other areas that are exciting in building on this research. We run tens of thousands of experimental trials. Here you can see two of my students, Osby and Jose, running experiments in the Atlantic Ocean with one of the battery-free sensors that could be used for temperature and pressure sensing, which is important for climate application. And while I've focused my talk on bringing the Internet of Things to observe the underwater world for climate applications, there's many other applications. For example, using our cameras to discover new species in the ocean, or using them in monitoring aquaculture farms. If you're not familiar, aquaculture refers to seafood farming, which is the world's fastest growing food sector. And using our sensors, we can start developing next generation aquaculture systems to support food security. And there's many other applications in robotics, disaster response, and so on. One of the areas that I'm very excited about is actually in extraterrestrial exploration. Scientists discovered extraterrestrial oceans in Saturn's moon Enceladus and Jupiter's moon Europa. And as you can imagine over there, it's even more difficult to replace a sensor's battery once you've shipped it on a space mission. So we're starting discussions with NASA scientists on how we can incorporate our technology as part of future space missions. And while in this talk, I focus on our work in how we can send messages underwater and decode them without batteries, my group does various kinds of sensor technologies for ambient sensing in new domains and applications, from in-body and health monitoring using, for example, these micro implants that can be swallowed or injected into the body, to retail and supply chain applications, where we actually recently launched a startup in this space, to robotics and manufacturing, where you're able to let robots see things that are invisible to the human eye, and even to augmented reality, where you extended human perception beyond line of sight and allowing people to see invisible objects. Of course, none of this would have been possible without my amazing group of students and postdocs and researchers, where we think together about new technologies and new ways that we could do ambient sensing and monitoring and build these technologies and bring them to the real world. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and feel free to reach out to me with any questions.